The Roman general Pompey rolled into Jerusalem and surrounding areas with his army around in the year 63 BCE, and he deposed the last independent Jewish king. These kings were called Hasmoneans. That was a family name, and Pompey established Roman rule over the land of Palestine, as it was called by the Romans. He allowed the kings, the Hasmonean kings, to stay on the throne as basically as puppets, answering to the Romans. But that lasted about 25 years or so until a man by the name of Herod, who was related by marriage to the Hasmoneans, but was also related to the Edomites, one of Israel's adversaries. Herod became king, and this is the guy known as Herod the Great, and he became king of the Jews. But he also reported to the Romans, and so even though he had the title king, he had no real independence. Well, what did Judaism look like in this time period? This is around the time period of the rise of Christianity, by the way. We'll talk more about it later next week when we talk about Christianity. But the Jewish historian Josephus talks about three different parties or groups of Jews who lived during this time period. One group was called the Sadducees. They believed that there was no afterlife at all, that when you died, you died. They believed in free will. They rejected oral law in favor of the written law, or Torah. That was one group, the Sadducees. There was another group called the Essenes, who did believe in predestination rather than free will, and they had a separate sacred calendar. Many scholars think, probably most scholars who study it, think that the Essenes were responsible for the creation of most of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found starting in 1947 and in the Judean desert right around the Dead Sea. The third group that Josephus mentions was called the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in a future messianic age that the Messiah, the King, would rule over the Jews. They believed in free will, but they believed that God has foreknowledge of what will happen. So in this way, they were kind of halfway in between the Sadducees' view of free will and the Essenes' view of predestination. And another form of Judaism that arose late in the Second Temple period was Christianity, but we'll save that for next week. Well, there were a group of Jews called Zealots who arose. They didn't like they didn't like being subject to the Romans, and so they started a revolt. This is called the First Jewish Revolt against Rome. It lasted from 66 to 73 CE, so we're in the Common Era now, not BCE. And the Romans had a much bigger army. The Zealots believed they could overthrow Roman rule and make it too difficult for the Romans to hold the territory. They were sadly mistaken, and the Romans rolled into town, destroyed the temple, the Second Temple now, and this war ended with the massacre at a place called Masada. Well, the fall of the Second Temple was the second great catastrophe to afflict the Jews after their emergence in the land of Canaan. The first great catastrophe was the Babylonian exile and the destruction of Solomon's temple, the first temple. And so the first destruction caused a transformation in Judaism. When Solomon's temple was destroyed and many of the leading Jews were exiled to Babylonia, one of the things that happened, as I said last week, was that they came in, last video, was that they came into contact with some of the ideas of Zoroastrianism, and some of their own theological ideas developed. They developed the idea of absolute monotheism. Before this time, the Jews, it's more accurate to say that the Jews were henotheistic rather than monotheistic. Let me write that down. Henotheism and monotheism, both, if you look at the roots, they both come from roots that mean one. Heno means one in Greek, mono means one in Latin. But henotheism is different. Henotheism says that we, as a group, we only worship one God. However, we acknowledge that there may be other gods. We're not saying that other gods don't exist, but our group, just worships one God. That is a more accurate description of the religion of ancient Israel prior to the Babylonian exile. They worshipped Yahweh, a God named Yahweh, but they didn't necessarily deny that other gods existed. Think about the Ten Commandments, for example, if you're familiar with that. The first commandment says, you shall have no other gods before me. It doesn't say there are no other gods. It just says you shall have no other gods before me. It almost implies that other gods exist. During the Babylonian exile, the concept of absolute monotheism became central to Jewish thinking, and from this point forward, the Jews were convinced that their God was the only God in the universe, and all the others were fake gods, false gods. As a result of this first catastrophe of the destruction of Solomon's temple, the synagogue was created. There was no place to worship. They couldn't worship in the temple because it had been destroyed, plus they were so far away. So they created the synagogue during the Babylonian exile and following the Babylonian exile. And even when the temple was rebuilt 50 years later or so, 70 years later, the synagogue still existed. And Jews still met in synagogues, particularly outside of Palestine, in places like Babylonia and Egypt and Europe. They met in synagogues. Another thing that developed in Judaism, not a concept, but another important development in Judaism, was the creation of a canon of Scripture. That is, a fixed list of scriptural texts. So that these texts began to be written. There was the Pentateuch that we've already talked about, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There were other books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. There were books of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. There were Psalms, the Proverbs, Daniel, Chronicles, many other books. And these books were all written, or at least came to their final form, during the Second Temple period. And so these are all important developments as a result of the Babylonian exile, the first great catastrophe. The idea of the Messianic hope that God would bring a Davidic king to sit on the throne, that developed during this time. And then the development of these various forms of Judaism, or sometimes scholars refer to them as Judaisms, plural. So that was the first catastrophe. The second catastrophe, the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, this led to a number of important developments in Judaism that led to the development, or the emergence, rather, of what is now known as Rabbinic Judaism. All right? The Roman destruction of the Second Temple led to the closing of the canon. No new books of Scripture were written, and the canon was closed, and what became the Tanakh, it didn't happen immediately, but within a couple of centuries, Jews agreed on which books were in and which books were out, which books were part of their canon. There was a renewed interest on the study of Scripture. This was already something that was characteristic of the synagogue, but as long as the temple was around, there were laws that talked about sacrifices that needed to be made on a regular basis, and so the Jews, at least those who lived close enough to visit the temple on occasion, practiced, they brought sacrifices and participated in that aspect of Jewish worship. Once the temple was destroyed, the Second Temple, that was no longer a possibility. So the Jews, many of the leading Jews, reinterpreted Scripture to say that sacrifice is no longer possible. Therefore, prayer and study of Torah takes the place of sacrifice. And so study of the sacred texts began to take the place of the sacrificial system following the destruction of the Second Temple. The codification of the oral law, remember that there were oral traditions that were passed down. The written law, that's the sacred text, the Tanakh, was written down, but there were also many oral traditions that were passed down. These oral traditions were eventually called the Mishnah. They were written down around the year 220. And they were, we'll talk more about the Mishnah in a bit, but they began to be written down around the year 220. And then the Talmud was another codification of oral law that took place as a result of this second catastrophe. The Jews also developed a self-identity as a people of diaspora. Diaspora means those who are spread beyond their original homeland. It was used originally to refer to the Jewish people who spread beyond their original homeland in Israel. It's used nowadays to refer to, for example, the African diaspora, the people of African descent who live places other than Africa, like the U.S. or Europe or various other places. And also the fall of the Second Temple, the second great catastrophe, led to the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism. So let me tell you a little bit about that story. There was a guy by the name of Yohanan ben Zakkai, and he was a leading Jew, a Jewish rabbi or teacher in Jerusalem. He was in the city while it was being besieged by the Romans during the first Jewish revolt. And he said, I have to get out of here. We have to figure out a way to allow Judaism to survive. He was very much opposed to the revolt. He was opposed to the zealots. But, the Romans didn't make a sharp distinction between Jews who revolted and Jews who didn't. As far as they were concerned, they were all responsible. So Yohanan ben Zakkai had his followers smuggle him out of the city in a coffin. They pretended it was a funeral procession. They went outside the city walls. Once they got out there, Romans let him go. They didn't care. He got out of the coffin, made his way to the Roman general Vespasian. He convinced him of his own peaceful intentions. He said, look, all I want to do is I want to establish a form of our religion that will be a nonviolent form of our religion and one where we can study our sacred texts. And, oh, by the way, he said to Vespasian, I predict that you will be elevated to emperor soon. Well, Vespasian liked that, and sure enough, he did become emperor. And so he allowed Yohanan ben Zakkai and his followers to leave the city of Jerusalem and to settle in a port city called Yavne. And from that coastal city of Yavne, this became the center of Palestinian Judaism. Remember, there were also Jews still living in Babylonia. And Yavne became the home of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish council. Well, so this is the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism. There was a second war that we won't talk about. Then there was a third war that began in 132, and this is called the Third Jewish Revolt, and it was led by a man by the name of Simeon Bar Kokhba. His real name was Simeon ben Kosiba, but he was called Bar Kokhba, which is Aramaic for son of the star, because his followers believed him to be the promised Messiah, and the star was a messianic symbol from the book of Numbers. Well, he led a revolt against the Romans, in part because of the Roman Emperor Hadrian's decision to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and rename it Aelia Capitolina, and to build a temple to the Roman god Jupiter there. Well, this infuriated the Jews, including Simeon Bar Kokhba. He led a rebellion. Short story is, it didn't succeed. He was captured. He was killed, and many of his followers were killed too. In fact, one of his most famous followers was named Rabbi Akiba. Akiba is mentioned in the Talmud, the Talmud, but the Mishnah many times. But he had hoped that Simeon Bar Kokhba would be the Messiah, but Rabbi Akiba was also executed by the Romans along with Bar Kokhba. Well, after this, the Romans said, these Jews are a lot of trouble, and they were all expelled from Jerusalem. They said, they just won't stop revolting against us. So all the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, and for the next 1,000 years or so, really more than that, next almost 1,700 years, there was a very, very small Jewish population in the city, and sometimes there were no Jews at all in the city of Jerusalem. It wasn't until the year 1700 that about 1,000 Jews decided to get up and move to Jerusalem, following a man by the name of Judah the Pious. By this time, Jerusalem was under the control of the Ottoman Turks. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Mishnah. These, remember I said that the Tanakh was the sacred text of the Jews. Well, there are other important texts that don't have the same status as a Tanakh, but they are very important to many Jews, anyways, today. The Mishnah was the first of these. It was the oral law that was codified around the year 220. It included the words of famous rabbis from the Second Temple period and later, such as Hillel, Shammai, Gamaliel, Rabbi Akiva, I've already mentioned. And it was put together by a man who was called Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince, around the year 220 CE. And so he wrote down all these oral teachings. Well, there were a lot of oral teachings that made it into the Mishnah and a lot that didn't, and these are recorded in other supplemental writings called the Tosefta and the Baraitot. Basically, there are two types of material in the Mishnah. Halakha, which are legal materials, tells what Jews ought to do to be observant Jews. Then Haggadah, which is folklore, anecdotes, just stories, entertaining stories. Well, no sooner was the Mishnah written than rabbis began to debate exactly what it meant. And so these oral traditions were passed down for a few centuries, a couple of centuries, and then these interpretations began to be written down, and they were called the Talmud. In fact, there are two Talmuds. There is a Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud that was written between 350 and 400 CE, and the larger Babylonian Talmud, which was completed between 500 and 700. And both of these Talmuds are commentaries on the Mishnah. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of the same material, but also some different material. If you look on the class website under this week's section on Judaism, you'll see a link there to a picture of the orders of the Mishnah and another one to the Talmud. And I want you to look at the Talmud, how it's laid out there. It's very interesting. The Talmud, even though it's called the Talmud, it includes the Mishnah. The Talmud includes the Mishnah. It's right there in the center column, if you're looking at it. It's right there in the center column. Below the Talmud is the Gemara. These are other remarks related to the Mishnah. And then, the Gemara, these are commentaries on the Mishnah. This is, I guess you might call it the Talmud proper. And then there are other commentaries on the Talmud. There's a commentary by Rashi in the right-hand column, commentary by other scholars in the left-hand column. So what exactly is this Mishnah? Let me just read a little bit of this is the very beginning of the Mishnah. It's a debate about how, when the Shema, remember what I said at the beginning of the last video I did, the sacred prayer of the Jews, how often and when should it be said, and at what time of night, and so forth. That's what this first little bit of the Mishnah talks about. It says, from what hour should they say the Shema in the evening? And then the answer is, until from the hour that the priests enter their homes to eat their heave offering, until the end of the first watch. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. But the sages say, that is, different people than Rabbi Eliezer, they say until midnight. Rabbi Gamaliel says until the rise of dawn. And so what's being done? What's going on here is the Mishnah is recording different opinions about how the law ought to be interpreted. And the Mishnah is full of this sort of thing, these different opinions about how the law ought to be interpreted. I have to fix my screen here. It's to find my my notes. Okay, here we go. All right. The Mishnah and the Talmuds are very important scriptures. Scripture isn't the right word. Very important texts for the Jews. And Orthodox Jews still read the Mishnah and the Talmud, and other Jews may as well. One of the most important Jews of the Middle Ages I've already mentioned briefly. This is Rashi. He wrote the first extensive commentary on the Talmud. He lived in the 11th century in France. He also wrote a commentary on the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. Another important Jew was named Maimonides. Maimonides was born in Cordoba, Spain in 1138, but his family was forced to flee Spain, and they moved to Egypt. He settled in Cairo. He became an expert in medicine, but also in Jewish law. He served as a court physician to Saladin, one of the great Muslim rulers of the era. He is the one he became a Talmudic scholar. He is the one, if you ever hear people say there are 613 laws in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, they're quoting Maimonides, because he's the one who came up with the number 613. He summarized these into 13 articles of Jewish faith, which I'm not going to read to you. They're there in your class notes for Unit 1. And he also wrote, later in life, he wrote something called A Guide for the Perplexed, which tried to reconcile philosophy and a literal sense of the Torah and also to talk a little bit about Jewish mysticism. Now, Jewish mysticism has had its rise and fall, and there are people who have been interested in it for centuries, and it's sort of back in vogue a little bit, not only among Jews, I should say, but if you've ever heard of the word Kabbalah or Kabbalah, this is what Jewish mysticism, this is a part of Jewish mysticism. Jewish scholars in the Middle Ages, some Jewish scholars, were interested in passages like the creation account in Genesis 1 and the prophet Ezekiel's vision of a fiery chariot in Ezekiel chapter 1. And so they began speculating on mysticism. It's sort of a philosophical way of reading or looking at the scriptures. I won't go into all the details here. One of the most important texts, it's called the Zohar, and the Zohar is a foundational text of Jewish mysticism, written in the 13th century. I have a link on the class website to some Kabbalistic speculation, some of the ways that some of the Kabbalic scholars organized their understanding of reality. One of the most important leaders of Jewish mysticism was a man by the name of Isaac Luria. He lived from 1534 to 1572 in Galilee, the city of Safed. He was a leading rabbi and a mystic, and he is known as the father of modern Kabbalah. He was impressed by reading the Zohar, and so impressed was he that he withdrew from his own family. He visited them only on the Sabbath, and he said as few words as possible so he could devote his time to studying the scripture and studying the Zohar. As I said, he was considered the father of modern Kabbalah. People came from far and wide to study with him, and he became a popular teacher. And after Isaac Luria died, one of his students, Rabbi Chaim Vital, spread Isaac Luria's teachings, and Chaim Vital saw himself as a messianic figure. Not a messianic figure. He saw himself as the Messiah. All right, I'm going to call it quits here, and I'll be back with another video later.